Do you remember how at the end of Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent turns into a dragon? Oh, you do? It's one of the most famous scenes in Disney history? Oh, well, I mean, of course you did. I mean, Prince Philip has already fought through the forces of darkness, through ogres and goblins, with the aid of the real protagonist of the movie, the Three Fairies. He'd hacked through the thorns conjured by Maleficent, and right as his journey is nearest its end, the big bad herself shows up. Someone who, until now, has commanded legions of darkness, twisted the laws of reality with a whim, and she emerges to stop him. Now, we know she's capable of great power, but we don't have a visual sense of the sheer magnitude of her strength within her. Not until she grows to a castle-sized dragon and unleashes all the powers of hell upon our protagonist. Each of her fangs the size of Philip's sword. How the hell is this guy supposed to fight this? It takes all of the fairies collectively and their magic for Philip to stand a chance at overcoming this obstacle, taking advantage of his raw skill, talent, and exploiting the 1-in-a-million sword throw that, had it missed, would have left Philip dead to rights. The dragon at the end is the ultimate David and Goliath finale to any fantasy epic, where the hero needs to stop a dragon in order to stand a chance of salvation, of happiness, of joy, of saving someone else, of reaching his destination. And sure, while the big bad can take any number of forms at the end of the story, the dragon is the most emblematic. And I'm also covering it because this week is Dragon Week. Don't know what Dragon Week is? Well, let me explain what Dragon Week is. Monster Week is an annual community event organized by Ginny D and Pointy Hat to bring together the TTRPG community on YouTube to talk about a single topic for a single week. I am not a TTRPG creator, but a general video essayist, and I thought the idea was cool, so I decided to make something with it. I don't know if this will count in their playlist for Dragon Week, whatever, but I thought it was neat, and I thought, why not talk about dragons? Because it's a cool topic. There we go. Anyway, and yes, this will also count some dragon-adjacent transformations, like Jafar turning into a giant snake in Aladdin, because bear with me, you'll see my point. Dragons throughout fiction, especially Western fiction, represent the final force of an insurmountable evil, a great power, one that shakes the very earth beneath its claws. It makes sense that it would serve the final gatekeeper between our protagonist and whatever goals they seek. The ultimate representation of power, dragons often represent one of the many sins, wrath, greed, pride especially. Dragons like Smaug lay atop their treasure with a sense of ownership, the gold forming a suit of armor to their underbelly, offering an extra layer of seemingly impenetrable armor, save that little gap. An arrow can just slip right through.
My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are like swords. My claws, spears!
They're too strong for the hero to confront directly. If a hero fought them with a sword like other heroes have before, they would die and fail. And, it's not a good scene. I mean, what are you going to do? Like, try to sword fight the fire coming down from their mouth? No. So the hero has to rely on a weakness, a vulnerability, stealth, something that they can exploit using wits and cleverness. However, why would a dragon even show up in your narrative? It doesn't make sense for every story to end with a dragon, and yet so often, even where they avoid dragons as best as possible, a dragon finds their way somewhere. Dragons as the abrupt final boss of a story is nothing new. Beowulf spent most of his epic fighting Grendel and his mother, two monsters born of the line of Cain, only to at the very end confront a dragon, one that would lead to his untimely, or perhaps very timely, demise. It just feels a little random after fighting humanoid enemies to be confronted by a dragon, doesn't it? And I will say this, unpopular opinion, I kind of like how that one version of Beowulf that Zemeckis made ends with the dragon being the offspring of Beowulf, the coupling between him and Grendel's mother. It kind of shows his own sins coming back to bite him on the ass. Granted, that movie has a lot of issues, and least of all the dead, soulless CGI eyes, and the idea that Beowulf is not nearly as grandiose a hero as he claims to be. And I think that kind of defeats the purpose of the original poem, and the ideas therein. Because in the original poem, Beowulf is just a hero. He's not a braggart. He is speaking his truths as a man of the people, and the epic recounts his many adventures. The dragon is awoken by a greedy thief that disturbs the dragon's treasure hoard. In many ways, it exists as a parallel to Grendel, the monster who at the start of the journey was disturbed by the loud noises of the local mead hall. There's a sense that evil is just this force that lies dormant until mankind encroaches upon its territory. It applies an almost animalistic drive to evil. In the same way, Beowulf only rises to action in response to monsters attacking man, creating this action-reaction, cause and effect kind of thing between the people, the monsters, and the heroes that defend people. And Beowulf fits within this natural order. He is a force rather than a person. But in that sense as well, the Hobbit also does something similar to this. Dragons in Middle-earth are entities of greed and avarice that need to be overcome, and they hoard treasure that man, dwarf, orc, everyone seeks. In The Hobbit, Bilbo fails to stop Smaug, though he does identify a weakness that is exploited by the bowman Bard. Whereas in Beowulf, Beowulf dies, stopping the dragon with his bare hands and strength. In this sense, you either can't beat it yourself, or you use your strength and wits to overcome it at the cost of your life. But another idea that's established in folklore is that the dragon is not always the main threat. It's more of a symptom of a bigger threat. In Beowulf, the dragon would never have done anything if a thief didn't mess around in its halls. And likewise in The Hobbit, once Smaug is beaten, the Battle of the Five Armies happens, and people fight over the treasure Smaug left behind. The greed does not end with the dragon. It just continues and someone else tries to take it. I think one example of a villain turning into a dragon that's very interesting is in the Volsunga saga between Sigurd and Fafnir. Sigurd slays the dragon Fafnir in the famous epic. That's well known. Fafnir was once a dwarf who killed his father in order to take possession of a cursed ring and a treasure. In this case, it's Fafnir's greed that transforms him into this grandiose dragon. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, it's kind of the opposite of what the One Ring does to Smeagol, where the ring becomes a burden that diminishes Smeagol into this addicted, messy creature named Gollum. In this case, greed enriches the body as opposed to diminishes it. But I digress. So Fafnir becomes a giant dragon, doesn't seem to mind too much. He seems pretty content to be a dragon. Now, Fafnir's brother, Regan, forges this sword for the hero Sigurd to take his brother out with. Now, Sigurd stands no chance against the former dwarf turned dragon with raw power. I mean, it's a dragon. So instead, Sigurd hides in a little pit on the path that Fafnir travels to all the time. He feels comfortable in his own domain and does not notice Sigurd lurking in the shadows with his sword outstretched. And thankfully, one thrust at the right moment, when Fafnir's not looking, is all it takes to carve out the dragon's heart. And as Fafnir decides to cook the dragon's heart, a series of events happens, he gets some blood in his mouth, and this imparts the ability to speak to animals. And as he hears this, he hears all the birds and the squirrels chirping about how Regan plans on betraying Sigurd to take the gold, and which leads the hero to slay the real villain and take the treasure for himself as a reward. Now, we see a few components here that are very interesting. The cycle of the dragon not being the final threat, and of the dragon being something a villain transforms into as a symptom of their inner evil. Further, the hero wins not by brute force, but rather through clever cunning. These are the components we will see time and time again, because the power imbalance between the hero and the dragon is important. The dragon must seem insurmountable. If the dragon could be punched in the face, it wouldn't be a dragonful threat. The curse of becoming a dragon also plays into Dragon's Dogma, the video game. The Arisen, the player character, can choose to become a dragon after slaying the dragon you've hunted the whole game. This is, of course, the bad ending, because in this case, you're continuing a cycle of violence that you spent the whole game trying to break. But to break the cycle, the Arisen needs to end their own life. So, it's your choice. Perish or become the evil that creates the cycle anew. In this sense, becoming a dragon is a curse. You're turned into this monster that forces and dominates the world, but the world requires it. It's part of the natural order. You are indeed evil, but you are functioning within a cyclical nature that is part of nature. And to break the chain comes at great sacrifice. So even if you beat the dragon, you're not done losing something yet. In this case, the dragon becomes bigger than just the physical threat of the dragon. It's also the conceptual threat of the dragon. I think most people think of Disney when they think of the dragon at the end of the film, especially with Sleeping Beauty. Now, in prior versions of Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent does not exist. Older versions of the story do have villains, such as an evil queen who is part ogre and wants to eat the princess. But this queen character is not the same fairy that curses the princess. It's a different character entirely. So when Disney adapted the story, they took components of both characters, mixing an evil queen that wants to hurt the princess with the fairy that curses the princess in the first place. What's interesting is Maleficent is one of the few Disney villains to have a transformation at this point in time. Now after Maleficent, you got Madame Mim, you got Ursula, Jafar, Yzma, though she turned into a cat, so does that really count? And Nerissa from Enchanted. But before that, who transformed? Oh wait, there was one example I neglected to mention. The evil queen from Snow White. The evil queen does transform, doesn't she? But rather than become a giant dragon with great power, she becomes an old crone. Interesting. Both transform in a way that reflects their inner darkness on the outside, but the evil queen becomes this cackling, frightening old woman who's ultimately very weak. Though she does poison Snow White, she's ultimately beaten because a lightning bolt blows out the ground from beneath her, and a boulder she planned on dropping on the dwarves falls on her instead. She is undone by the forces of nature and through her own hubris. She's not much more powerful when she transforms, but Maleficent is incredibly powerful when she transforms. See, unlike the queen, whose transformation reveals that for all her grandeur and threatening aura, she was ultimately powerless to defend what she wanted, Maleficent proves she can back up every word she says. Like, what does the queen want? She wants to be the fairest of them all, and Snow White just effortlessly beats her. She's powerless. But Maleficent, she is a witch of the highest order, commanding armies of darkness, able to scatter her own legion to the winds with a few spells. She is powerful. And so her inner darkness revealed is one that she is in complete command over and exudes strength. And Prince Philip, what's interesting is he doesn't use trickery like Sigurd. He doesn't manipulate things like Bilbo, and he doesn't die like Beowulf. He fights the dragon and he wins. He barely wins. He needs the help of the fairies to do so, but he wins. And what's very interesting is that he wins by a David and Goliath kind of victory. The little rock thrown through the sling to hit Goliath in the head. The sword thrust right through the heart at the right instance. But this set a precedence for Disney villains who transformed. If the heroes fought the villain, they'd have to use their wits, but they would still fight. Though I think one example stands out as an exceptionally interesting one, and that's Jafar. Now, Jafar, again, doesn't turn into a dragon, giant snake, and a genie. I get it. Okay. But of all the Disney villains, the power transformation with Jafar is interesting because usually it represents an opportunity for an antagonist to back up their threats with power. Jafar is not an exception, but something that is different about Jafar is that he wins. He wins. He wins multiple times over. He wins. He has Aladdin dead to rights. He's got Agrabah. He has Jasmine. He has everything he wants. He is all powerful, and there is nothing that Aladdin can do. There's no physical trick he can pull. There's no sword he can throw into Jafar's heart or whatever. So instead, Aladdin wins not through physical force. He wins through psychological force. Jafar's weakness is not power. He is all-powerful at this point, though he could be more powerful. That insecurity is what gets him. He knows someone is more powerful than him, and thus he must become more powerful than the genie, by becoming a genie himself. Again, in most cases, the villain's transformation is basically a raw power upgrade. Even Fafnir turning into a dragon doesn't seem to bother him all that much. But in Aladdin, the transformation from Jafar to man, to Jafar to sorcerer, to Jafar to giant snake, and Jafar to genie is what saves the day. Because the power comes with restraint. It comes with an itty-bitty living space. Despite all the power in the world, you're powerless to the forces that bind even yourself. Jafar is brought down by his own ambition. And granted, it's not the first time it's happened. I mean, every Indiana Jones movie ends with the villain being beaten because he got exactly what he wanted, and what he wanted wasn't what he expected. The villain's greed causes self-destruction. In this case, greed itself is what undoes the villain. And that's interesting. Disney loves these karmic deaths, where the villain brings about their own ends. And I mean, fair. There's a lot of great Disney villain deaths. Maybe one day I'll rank all the Disney villains by how cool their deaths are. Actually, Yeah, I will do that. That sounds incredibly awesome. I'll do that at some point. Expect that video coming up. Other fairy tale inspired stories also have dragon transformations as well. In Sailor Moon R, the villain Esmeralda is transformed forcibly into a dragon, but what's interesting is it's kind of unremarkable in that arc. Chibiusa's change into Black Lady is more distinct and more memorable, and the main villain, Wiseman, doesn't become a dragon. No, he becomes a planet in the manga and the Crystal anime. So, it's odd how the Emerald being a dragon seems unremarkable, but then again, consider that Sailor Moon deals with higher stakes than dragons. Like, they're talking like the cosmos and the core creative forces of chaos. And, look, if you're fighting the universe, like the core elements of universal power, a dragon's small potatoes by comparison. Other times, especially in video games, the transformation into a dragon might be part of a larger boss fight. Case in point, Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil 8, who transforms from a giant vampire mother into a colossal bio-nightmare dragon. That is much less mother in that case. Of course, this doesn't end well, and to win the player has to use raw skill, and they succeed ultimately if you play the game correctly. On the other hand, the villain Jack of Blades from Fable also transforms into a dragon, resulting in a final boss fight far more satisfying than the final boss fight of Fable 2. I am still angry about the final boss fight of Fable 2, because that is not a fight. That is nothing. Games, though, can sometimes cheapen the experience, because depending on how the game is formulated and played, you might not require skill to win so much as bigger number than the other guy, or using the right potion at the right moment. And that's still skill, I guess, but if you level up high enough, a dragon is no different from any other threat. Games like Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts, as much as I love them, if you level up enough, you can usually win. Some games try to compensate for this. Sephiroth, for example, in Final Fantasy VII, offers a different level of difficulty depending on how strong your character is going into the fight. And their transformations are often very distinct, not like dragons, but more reflective of their inner nature. Kafka becomes a parody of the Divine Comedy. Sephiroth becomes a giant seven-winged angel before fighting Cloud as himself. Then you get Jet from Final Fantasy X. Jet is forcibly transformed into Sin, which is either a dragon or a giant whale. I'm blurring the line here. But the whole game is about undermining that transformation, about breaking the cycle so it doesn't continue, much like in Dragon's Dogma. Though that requires punching the founder of an organized religion in the face enough times at the end. The final boss is a tick. It is not the Grand Jet who's forced into this cycle unwillingly. It's the little worm in the back of everything else, manipulating things behind the scenes. Even though Final Fantasy X's final boss fight is underwhelming, it's underwhelming by choice, to show how after all this fighting, all these people subjected to this cycle, the real big bad is like a little tiny little flea. That's kind of cool, I think. Sometimes the villain doesn't transform into a dragon, but summons one. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, Seto Kaiba has the Blue Eyes White Dragon cards, which is, I guess, the incarnation of his lost love from ancient Egypt, but that's a whole other discussion right there. And he can take 3 dragons and then fuse them into 1 dragon. That's kind of cool. And the guy travels in jets, shaped like dragons. The guy maybe likes dragons a little too much. I'm a little concerned for Seto Kaiba. He may have a problem. Of course, here the themes are that the villain is trying to control something possibly outside their own levels of control. Seto Kaiba, it's a bunch of playing cards. He can handle that. But often, villains who use dragons as tools or weapons will sometimes experience the dragon turning against them, or just drop dead on them. In the surprisingly good Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, the villain, the Scar King, manipulates a dragon-like kaiju. It's only when that dragon is freed from his control, however, that he faces a very quick death at the hands of every single kaiju just beating into him at once. It's very satisfying. There are occasions where otherwise good, pure characters are transformed unfairly into dragons, against their will. It's not a reflection of any inner darkness, but rather the mad machinations of some other magic user. Case in point, Fallon from Delicious in Dungeon. Fallon is transformed forcibly into a dragon, merging with a red dragon that consumes her. She is all-powerful, chaotic, and a mess, but the goal is not to slay her or stop her, but rather salvage her and save her from this fate. There are still hints of humanity within the Chimera's form. Also, she causes Marcel to have gay panic is the best way to put it. And again, it still happens. Dragons still show up in stories, but I feel like it's less prominent now. And I'm not sure what exactly caused it, but I have a few ideas. One thing is that the villain transformations change from becoming this bigger and bigger entity to becoming more refined, maybe more angelic. I mentioned Sephiroth before, but one example I think really pushed momentum in this direction of the villain becoming more, maybe smaller, is Dragon Ball Z. In Dragon Ball Z, during the Namek Saga, the heroes fight Frieza. And first they fight his army on Namek. They fight the Ginyu Force, Zarbon, Dodoria, all these guys. And you think, well, if these guys are powerful, who is commanding them? And Frieza undergoes multiple transformations. At first, each one more frightening and larger than the last. And you think, okay, how can you get any more frightening than this big old xenomorph-inspired transformation? But his final form is surprising. It's smaller, it's refined, it's almost stripped down. It looks like his weakest form. He looks almost like something that's emerged from the shell of his former self, not even the same color. For a moment, the heroes underestimate him, to their own detriment. Yes, I know his 100% form has all these big muscles, I know he has the golden form later on, but in Dragon Ball Z, this started a trend where the villain would undergo these monstrous transformations that got bigger and larger and more frightening before, in the very end, becoming more angelic, becoming smaller. Kid Buu and Perfect Cell are great examples of this, though Perfect Cell also has his Cell Max form, but we're not going into that. The idea was that the final form wasn't larger, but more refined. It was the elements of the character stripped down to their purest, most distilled entity. And a lot of manga artists took heavy inspiration from Dragon Ball Z moving forward. Yes, some bad guys had these epic transformations, but the final confrontation would often be between the hero and the distilled version of their enemy, the core components, all the extraneous details stripped away to the final bits. Now, another factor are superhero films themselves. Many films entered into a structure where the villain would be set up throughout the film only for the hero to face them in their true form, as they are in the comics in the third act. Basically, The Incredible Hulk does this with Abomination, Spider-Man 3 does this with Venom, Amazing Spider-Man 2 does this with the Green Goblin, the Avengers does this with the Chitauri invasion, Wonder Woman does this with Ares in the first film and Cheetah in the second film. The third act transformation into a villain became the trend, because it wasn't a bigger form, it was just their own form, fully realized. And I think the factor here too is that if the villain turns into a dragon, and the heroes can just punch the dragon, why not make them someone more physically of a comparable size? Because power isn't the factor. They're both equally powerful, at least contain a similar amount of power. A dragon is meant to be raw strength. So if they're both the same level of strength, who cares? Why make them so much bigger and so much more ferocious? Just make them exist on the same playing field so they can punch you hard in the face. The other thing too is that when a person transforms into a dragon, it can be iconic like with Maleficent, but often it looks like just a dragon. We're used to seeing this villain's face, their design, their persona, and becoming a giant lizard maybe strips that away from them a little bit. That happened with Enchanted, where Nerissa becomes this big dragon, and we know who the bad guy of the movie is. We know what they look like. And they already went through a transformation going from animation to live action already. So a third form, with that being live action dragon, it kind of strips it away a little bit. It feels like we're kind of moving away from what we're familiar with, and it doesn't feel as cathartic watching this villain who we've seen all this time get beaten, as opposed to this big transformation that's, kind of junky and clearly pastiching, Sleeping Beauty. I think the dragon transformation in Enchanted is the weakest link of the film, because that's where the film completely drops the pretense of being a very sophisticated pastiche and parody of Disney and just becomes playing the beats again, but less interestingly. Ultimately speaking, these are all reasons why some movies have opted not to show the dragon transformation at the end, or just have the villain take a form that's more mano-a-mano to the hero. There's one other factor I'm forgetting to mention. Dragons are awesome, so why not make the heroes dragons? This is especially true in Eastern media, where dragons aren't forces of evil, but rather forces of nature. Often they're wise, they're experienced, know how the world works. This also makes the fact that Kaido transforms into a dragon in One Piece all the more interesting, because that fight ultimately feels like it's waged between the embodiment of all the unstoppable forces of nature and something completely unbound by the limitations of reality. If I tie Luffy's fifth gear form into thematic resonance in One Piece with what I'm talking about here. If the dragon's natural order of things, Luffy exists as a defiance of that natural order, punching it in the face. Though admittedly, this whole read is very flawed, considering Kaido is the producer of the Smile Fruit, which is an unnatural abomination of all hell, And the main conflict of the Wano arc is the Straw Hat Pirates fighting fascism, a group that overthrew the natural order of things through underhanded tactics and cruelty. So, this read is flawed, to say the least, but it is a read with some grounding, at the very least in the final fight of the Wano arc, though contextually, Kaido has a lot more going on than just a force of nature. Yeah, okay, so heroes want to be dragons. Of course, Legend of Dragoon, underrated game. You turn into dragons the whole time. It's fantastic. It's great. I love Legend of Dragoon. It's very underdiscussed. Because dragons kick ass. So why not be a dragon? Corrin from Fire Emblem transforms into a dragon. It's really cool. And then there's American Dragon Jake Long. Yeah, I remember American Dragon Jake Long. Show about a kid turning into a dragon. How cool is that? That's great. That's every, middle school, elementary school's dream story. It's fantastic. And of course, heroes became more monstrous over time. We became more sympathetic towards the monsters overall. Hell, My Hero Academia, a pastiche of superhero films, has a hero who becomes a dragon. It's great. But then, things got a little weird, and we decided to make stories where we romance dragons, like Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, which is an entire series about how cool it would be to have a dragon girlfriend. One example I want to bring up quickly of this being really interesting is the movie Dragonheart, a 90s fantasy film that isn't super remarkable in the grand scheme of things. The story is not anything to write home about. The effects for the time were fantastic with the Sean Connery dragon, but what's interesting in our discussion is how the film focuses on an evil prince who is kept alive because a dragon donates part of his heart to the prince after he's fatally injured. Now, to kill the prince, the dragon must also die because they're bound by that heart. So, in an inversion of every other dragon story you've mentioned thus far, the dragon exposes his weak point in plain sight to the hero. The hero kills the dragon, the prince dies. They're connected. And so in order to stop the prince before he does something too terrible, the dragon sacrifices himself. And that, again, features into the idea of the dragon's weakness being exploited by the hero, but ultimately the weakness is welcomed by the dragon. And yes, I know one of the films has a guy who turns into a dragon also, but I digress. In Earthsea, we see the dragon Tehanu, who takes the form of a human girl who is horribly scarred but secretly a dragon, and is just as any other human being in the world, except a dragon. And that allows Tehanu to experience human bigotries and human structures of power from a very subjective perspective. And indeed, in Earthsea in general, the dragons represent the order of nature. Language of dragons creates the universe around them. It is the language of spellcasting. When the world's thrown out of balance, such as when Cobb decides to close the door to eternity and death, dragons are the first to start falling out of the sky, to die. The world is thrown out of balance, and the dragons are an extension of the cycle of nature that is good, being put out of whack. Dragons are not things to slay, but rather things you do not want to hurt, because to hurt a dragon is to hurt the nature of reality itself. And even then, in the first book, when Ged encounters a dragon, he does not slay the dragon, but rather asks the dragon for advice. He has to fight the dragon to an extent, yes, but his intention is not to kill. His intention is to temporarily subdue, because to command mastery over a dragon is to demonstrate his immense power as a mage. But in a sense, his idea that he could even master a dragon is his own arrogance. The dragon cannot be mastered, much like how the waves of the sea cannot be stopped forever. The moment you have a hero fight a dragon over and over again, it cheapens the dragon. It cheapens what it means. What is this uncontrollable force? That's one issue I had with Game of Thrones. Dragons start to become just another animal in the bestiary. That's why I have an issue with Fourth Wing. Dragons are just entities that you can tame and control and who are extensions of the self. And it's not interesting in the same way that dragons as this insurmountable, incredible force are. I always recommend Earthsea. I think it's an amazing work. But the dragons in Earthsea are unique in that they are not tamed. You cannot transform into one. You can disguise yourself as one, but you can never be one. But they can be you. The dragon can take a human form, but the human can never hope to be as magnificent, as powerful as the dragon. And those who claim ownership over nature, they are the true enemies. The systems of control are the enemies. In some stories, you fight the cycle. In other stories, the dragon represents the perpetuation of that cycle. And I think that discussion is a very interesting one. Because the villain transforming into a dragon, it's not just that dragons are cool, it's that dragons represent the final obstacle, the thing that all people cannot fight, a force beyond force.